This is Sherlock Holmes and the Clockmaker's Paradox, written by Barrel Krups.
Chapter 1. The Letter That Ticked. It was on a chill and overcast morning in early October, the kind that seemed to dim even the crackle of the fireplace at 221B Baker Street, that I, Dr. John Watson, first saw the envelope that would change the course of our days, and, in some small but unnerving way, our perception of time itself. Holmes had not yet risen. He lay draped across the settee like a marionette dropped mid-performance, one arm crooked above his head, the other dangling toward the floor where a scattering of monographs lay like fallen leaves. The smell of Turkish tobacco clung to the air, underscored by the faintest chemical trace of his latest experiment. Something involving radium dust and silk thread, if memory served. I had just returned from my morning rounds and was sorting through a small stack of post left by Mrs. Hudson. The usual detritus, an advertisement for a new brand of revolver oil, a politely worded bill from the chemist, and, most curiously, a letter addressed not to Holmes but to me. The envelope was of a heavy, cream-coloured stock, sealed with a wax crest I did not recognise, an intricate design, part fleur-de-lis, part hourglass, with the letters ER etched in Latin script beneath it. There was no return address. The postmark, oddly enough, was smudged nearly beyond recognition. It was not the sort of envelope one opens lightly. Something about it gave me pause, perhaps the density of it, or the very faint scent of oil and brass on the paper, like it had been handled by machines instead of men. Holmes stirred as I slit it open. "Ah, Watson," he murmured without opening his eyes, "if that's another pamphlet from the Royal Army Medical Corps, do spare me the agony." "It's not," I said, reading the opening line of the letter and feeling my blood cool by several degrees. "It's from a man named Elijah Rusk. Do you know him?" At the sound of the name, Holmes opened one eye, just barely. "Rusk? The clockmaker? Yes, I know of him. Camden Town, former Royal Engineer, bit of a recluse these days, if I recall. Why?" I handed him the letter without a word. Holmes sat up, his long fingers smoothing the page with surgical precision. He read in silence, his expression darkening line by line. Open quote, "To Dr. John Watson. I address you, Doctor, not out of familiarity, but because I believe you to be a man of principle, one who may be able to reach Mr. Holmes without delay. By the time you read this, I will be dead. I do not know how, only that I must. Time has ceased to be my ally. The clocks speak of it in lies. I have been followed, threatened, and, I suspect, marked for erasure. There is something I must entrust to Mr. Holmes, something I should have destroyed years ago. If he comes before the workshop is sealed, he may yet retrieve it. But he must not trust the clocks. They are not what they seem. Yours, in what little time remains, Elijah Rusk." Close quote. Holmes stared at the final signature for a long moment as though willing it to tell him more. "Curious," he said at last, rising to his feet. "Very curious." He crossed the room and yanked the curtains open. The London light that spilled in was grey and shivering, the sort of light that made the city feel like an old photograph, faded at the edges. "Well, Watson," he said briskly, already moving toward the coat stand, "it seems we are expected." Camden Town, 10:32 a.m. Elijah Rusk's workshop stood on a narrow, cobbled lane behind a disused churchyard, squeezed between two taller, soot-stained buildings that leaned inward like conspirators. The signage was modest, Rusk & Co., horology, restoration, commissions taken. But the window display hinted at more than mere craft. It was a cathedral of motion. Carriage clocks, barometers, brass cogs, and latticed gears, all arranged with almost obsessive symmetry. A constable stood outside, arms folded. He stepped aside quickly when Holmes showed him the letter. "Inspector Lestrade's already inside," the man said. "Door was bolted from within. We had to force the side entrance. Nasty business. Inside, the scent hit me first. Metal polish, oil, and something else. Not blood, not exactly, but the unmistakable chemical tang of mortality. Rusk's body lay slumped beside his work table, legs sprawled as if he'd simply folded in half. His eyes were closed. In one hand, clutched tightly, was a small pocket watch, its chain snapped. The time on its face read 10:07. But what struck me most were the clocks. There were hundreds of them. Grandfather clocks, cuckoo clocks, wall clocks, carriage clocks. They lined every surface, stood in corners hung from iron arms. Some ticked faintly, others lay silent. but not one showed the same time. The air was filled with a strange discordance, as though each clock were whispering a different truth. Lestrade looked up from where he crouched near the body. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. Bit of a head-scratcher, this one." Holmes didn't respond immediately. He was already circling the room, eyes half-lidded, every movement precise and silent, like a panther studying its prey. "No wounds," I noted aloud. "No blood. Rigour is just setting in." "Heart failure?" Lestrade offered. He was nearly 70, could have dropped dead at his work. Holmes made a soft, dismissive sound in his throat. "Unlikely. Observe the fingertips. Bruised, defensive bruising, though no sign of a struggle, and the watch." He bent closer. "Not his own." Lestrade frowned. "You sure?" Holmes straightened. "Rusk was left-handed. The watch is gripped in the right, and look, there's an engraving inside the case." He pried the back open delicately. Inside, etched with fine care, was a Latin phrase, tempus neminem manet. Time waits for no man. Holmes's eyes glittered. Indeed. The hidden floorboard. We stayed behind as Lestrade ordered the body taken away and the clocks catalogued. Holmes insisted on examining the workshop personally and thoroughly. He tapped along the floorboards with his cane, pausing only when a particular hollow sound gave him pause. "Watson," he said, gesturing. We pried the board loose together. Beneath it lay a small wooden box, wrapped in oiled canvas. Inside, a stack of blueprints, a cracked leather journal, and a strange device. It looked like a clock, but one that had been reimagined by a man who no longer believed in time. There were no numbers on its face. Instead, it bore concentric rings of rotating glass, filled with quicksilver and flecks of what might have been obsidian. The hands ticked, but irregularly. At times, they stopped entirely. "This," Holmes whispered, lifting the thing with the care of a surgeon holding a live organ, "is not a clock. It's something else." I opened the journal. The handwriting was cramped and feverish. Words jumped out at me. Perception drift, temporal compression, and a date that had been circled multiple times, March 14th, 1882. "What happened in 1882? I asked. Holmes's face had gone still. A good question, one that may explain why a man like Rusk was ready to die for whatever he was building. He turned the strange device in his hands, then held it to his ear. And for a brief, breathless moment, I swear this upon my name, the clocks in the room all paused, just for a heartbeat, as if the world had taken a sudden breath and held it. Then the ticking resumed, but it had changed. The cadence, the rhythm, it no longer matched. Holmes looked at me. "I believe, Watson," he said, "we are no longer keeping time. It is keeping us." Chapter 2. A Room Full of Ghosts. The body of Elijah Rusk had been removed by the time we returned to the workshop later that afternoon. Holmes insisted we leave and return only once the scene was undisturbed, once the police had tired of their clumsy intrusion, and the room, as he said, could breathe again. It was past 3 when we arrived. The sky above Camden Town stained a dull pewter, with a low haze pressing against the rooftops, as though the entire borough was being slowly folded shut. Holmes unlocked the front door with a key Lestrade had discreetly allowed him to borrow, one of many favours reluctantly granted over the years. The key turned with a sound like an old throat clearing. We stepped inside. Without the bustle of police boots and muttered speculation, the workshop had changed. The quiet was not silent but saturated, thick with the mutterings of clocks, the creaks of wood, the whisper of dust settling where it dared. Holmes stood just within the threshold, unmoving. "Do you feel it, Watson?" "I feel the quiet," I said. No, not just quiet. The absence of something. As if a choir had stopped mid-note, and the echo still haunts the rafters. This room remembers him. I didn't reply. Whether Holmes was speaking metaphorically or not, I couldn't be sure. His language tended toward the theatrical when a mystery had lodged in his brain. The clocks were still there, hundreds of them, standing sentinel on shelves and tables huddled in corners, clinging to the walls. And still, none of them agreed on the time. Some were off by mere minutes. Others, hours. One massive grandfather clock at the rear wall pointed to 4:12, while the pendulum ticked with a faint metallic gasp, as though tired of swinging. A delicate French mantel clock in porcelain declared the hour as 7:59, though its mechanism didn't seem to be running at all. "Look carefully, Watson," Holmes murmured, moving among them. Note how they disagree not only with each other, but also with us. Not a single clock reflects the time by my watch, and I set it from Big Ben not 2 hours ago. I frowned, drawing my own timepiece from my coat. Mine reads 3:48. Mine 3:50. Yet look here. He pointed to a stately regulator clock, elegant and tall, with an inlaid mahogany frame. Its hands read 10:07. The time Rusk's pocket watch displayed when we found him, I said. Holmes nodded. Do you suppose it stopped at the moment of his death? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt before the clock, studying the casing, then stood and moved to another, then another. No, look at the variation. Some stopped, some tick erratically. A few are perfectly sound, yet wildly off. I believe the disorder is deliberate. I looked around, increasingly uneasy. The atmosphere of the room was not oppressive exactly, but congested, like we had walked into a chapel where prayers had never been answered and had started to curdle in the air. Holmes suddenly straightened. Watson, close the door. Bolt it. I did so, and he dimmed the front lamps, letting the grey afternoon seep in through the upper windows, thin and cold, like fogged glass in a mausoleum. He then moved toward the far end of the room where Rusk's massive workbench stood, a cathedral of brass and wood, every tool in its proper place, chisels aligned with tweezers and loops, rows of miniature files and hand-cranked drills. But amidst the precision was chaos. Papers had been scattered, not by a struggle, but as if someone had rifled through them in haste. Holmes examined the mess for several minutes, silent save for the occasional hum of interest. At last, he produced a folded piece of paper from beneath a clockweight. Aha! This appears to have escaped notice. He handed it to me. The page was covered in spidery notes, most of them equations and phrases, phase lock, auditory synchronization, latent drift hypothesis, and the most legible sentence, subject perception diverges exponentially after 120 seconds of exposure. Full convergence may be impossible. I looked up. What in God's name was he working on? Holmes's brow furrowed. Something beyond mere horology. He wasn't building clocks, he was meddling with perception, perhaps even memory. I set the page down slowly. Could such a thing be possible? Holmes gave me a dry look. We have walked with murderers who see ghosts, madmen who believe in spirits in the blood, and scientists who swear by galvanic resurrection. I do not believe in impossibilities, Watson, only in explanations waiting to be uncovered. He turned his attention to the floor once again. The box we uncovered earlier, I said, gesturing. Should we examine the rest? Indeed. Holmes pried up the same floorboard, revealing the small cache we had previously uncovered. The journal still lay within, and the curious device, the knot clock, nestled in its wrappings. Holmes removed them again, this time with latex gloves he had brought from Baker Street. He laid the device on the workbench and retrieved a jeweler's loop from the tool rack. I watched as he examined the surface, running a fingertip over one of the rotating rings. There's something here, he murmured, etched beneath the outermost band, but the angle makes it almost invisible to the naked eye. He adjusted the loop, bent low and squinted. It's a name. A maker's mark? No, he paused. A child's name. Evelyn R. I blinked. A daughter or granddaughter, but nothing in the public records mentions family. He frowned. Let's see what else the journal holds. Holmes handed it to me, flipping to the back half. I read the first few pages this morning. Let us try toward the end. The script grew shakier as the entries progressed and darker, not in ink but in tone. Open quote, Sept 18th. They came again. Said I would regret not sharing the prototype. I told them the design is incomplete, unstable. That is a lie. I completed it months ago, but it cannot be allowed into their hands. They do not understand what it does. Close quote, open quote, Sept 24th. Evelyn's voice, I heard it again, just for a moment. I know she is gone, but when I activated the field, I swear I felt her presence, not her voice from memory, from now. As if she was still, close quote, open quote, Sept 30th. The clocks have begun to betray me. They lose time, not seconds, but events. Entire moments seem to vanish. I pour tea and find the cup already drunk. I cannot trust what I see anymore. The device, if it works, it bends experience. Close quote, open quote, Oct Sethi. Letter sent to Mr. Holmes. If anyone can stop them, it is he. But time is folding inwards. I feel it, like standing in a mirror's curve. If they come before he does, I must destroy the core. Evelyn cannot fall into their hands. Close quote, open quote, oct. 4th. They knocked. I did not answer. They will come again tonight, close quote. Holmes read over my shoulder in silence. Oct. 4th, he echoed. That was yesterday. And he was dead this morning, I said softly. Holmes stood up, as the air in the room felt heavier. I believe, Watson, that we have walked into a chamber built not only of wood and brass, but of memory, of desperation. He turned to the clocks again. And these, he said, are not just timepieces. They are sentinels, markers of something done or undone. Then something caught his eye. Watson, look there. High on the rear shelf, amid the rows of silent clocks, was a gap, a place where dust marked the outline of something now missing. A clock removed recently, Holmes muttered, standing on a small stool to inspect the area. And not by the police. Lestrade's men were instructed not to move anything. He descended and dusted his gloves. Someone returned after the murder, after our first visit. Someone who knew what they were looking for. Perhaps the corps he referenced in the journal? I asked. Holmes nodded grimly. And if it is as dangerous as he believed, we must find it before they use it. He looked at the knot clock once more, then at the page with Evelyn's name. This girl, this Evelyn, may be the key to all of this. Whether she lives or not, someone is trying to reach her, or replicate what she once was. Do you think she was real? I think Rusk believed she was. A low tolling echoed from somewhere in the workshop, not from any of the clocks, but from the old churchyard behind the shop. The hour, 4 o'clock. Holmes turned toward the sound. Time marches on, Watson, he said, but not always forward. Chapter 3, the 10th hour. It was nearly midnight by the time we returned to Baker Street, both of us weighted down by the day's revelations. Holmes had said little during the cab ride. He sat hunched with the journal in his lap, thumbing through pages, eyes flicking rapidly behind half-closed lids. The rain had begun to fall in a fine, whispering drizzle, turning the lamplight outside into golden smudges. When we stepped into the sitting room, Mrs. Hudson had left a tray for us, hot tea, bread, and a dish of cold beef. We ignored it. Holmes tossed his coat onto the arm of the chair and began pacing, pipe unlit in one hand, the other holding a folded page from Rusk's journal. I knew better than to interrupt. I am increasingly certain, he said at last, that this Evelyn was not a figment of Rusk's grief, but someone very real. Perhaps a relative, possibly a ward. But here's the interesting point, Watson. He refers to her as if she still is, not was. I settled into my chair and leaned forward. You think she's alive? I think, he said slowly, that Rusk believed her to be accessible through the machine. He laid the page flat on the desk and pointed to the notation again. Open quote. Evelyn's voice, not from memory, from now. Close quote. That sounds like delusion. Or it sounds like obsession, weaponized by scientific ambition. Either possibility is dangerous. I frowned. Do you really think he was attempting to... What? Speak to someone through time? Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. You of all people should know, Watson. Madness often travels the same road as genius. The only difference is whether you arrive at the destination with your mind intact. He returned to his pacing. I turned back to the journal, skimming the earlier pages this time. A set of schematics had been drawn across 3 folded sheets. The diagrams of the device were meticulously labelled. Phase gate, temporal resonance coil, memory entrainment wheel. Yet the layout resembled no clock I had ever seen. In fact, it looked more like a telescope mounted sideways onto a phonograph, something meant not for seeing but for listening through time. Watson, Holmes said suddenly, do you recall the time on the broken watch in Rusk's hand? 10:07, I replied. Same as one of the clocks in the back. He nodded slowly. And yet the time of death estimated by the coroner was several hours earlier, closer to 6. You think the time has significance? I think, he said, that someone believed it did, and went to great lengths to set more than one device to that hour. The question is why. He strode to his bookshelf and pulled down a worn leather volume, the Royal Engineers' Journal, 1870 to 1885. He flipped through with swift fingers until he reached a listing. Elijah Rusk was listed as a civilian engineer attached to the Royal Signals Division in India. Holmes murmured. Stationed in Simla, later transferred to Assam. Suspended from service in 1882 following what is only referred to as a project failure resulting in loss of life. He turned the book toward me. The brief entry listed no further details, just a date, March 14th, 1882. The same date underlined in his journal, I said. Holmes tapped the page. And precisely 10:07 was the last entry noted in the operation logs kept during that project. You have those logs? Obtained via a source I won't trouble you with, he said, closing the book. I sat back in my chair. So whatever happened on March 14th, 1882, at 10:07, it changed Rusk, possibly drove him mad, or sent him into hiding. He moved to the window, watching the rain trace rivulets down the glass. Mycroft knows something about this, he said at last. He must. The military angle, the classified project, and the phrase Project 10 scribbled in that journal. You mean to speak with him? I mean, Holmes said with that familiar glint returning to his eyes, to extract what he knows, whether he volunteers it or not. The Diogenes Club, Pall Mall. The following morning, Mycroft Holmes sat in his usual corner of the Diogenes Club, beneath a painting of Queen Victoria as Athena. He looked precisely as he always did. Portly, immaculately dressed, and somehow older than the last time I'd seen him, though it had been barely 2 weeks. He didn't rise when we entered. Holmes strode across the marble floor without preamble and placed the strange timepiece from Rusk's workshop on the table in front of his brother. Mycroft regarded it with a glacial expression. "Good morning, Sherlock," he said. "And Dr. Watson. Tea?" Holmes ignored the offer. "What do you know of Project 10? Mycroft adjusted his cuffs, enough to wish you weren't asking. "Then you're aware Elijah Rusk is dead?" "Unfortunately, yes. He left behind a device," Holmes said, gesturing to the strange clock, "and a journal. Both reference a child named Evelyn, a date in 1882, and a phenomenon involving time perception. There's more to this than a failed experiment." Mycroft sighed and finally leaned back. "You'll understand, I hope, that I cannot divulge classified military research." "You'll understand," Holmes countered, "that I will uncover it regardless. So perhaps you'd prefer to shape the narrative before it reaches the morning papers." That got his attention. "I can give you what is already declassified," Mycroft said slowly. "The rest I'll deny ever speaking of." He lowered his voice. "Rusk was brought in during the Afghan campaigns to develop a psychological manipulation device, one that could disorient prisoners, induce confusion, scramble time perception during interrogations. It was all theoretical, of course, based on emerging studies in auditory suggestion, clock pattern synchronization, but the Crown wanted something that could be used without bloodshed. Was it used? Mycroft hesitated. Once, in Assam, on a test group of locals. There was a misfire. The machine induced not confusion, but something closer to hallucination. One of the engineer's daughters was accidentally exposed during testing. Evelyn, I said. Mycroft nodded. She was never the same. Some said she aged years in days. Others said she vanished. Which is it? Holmes asked. No one knows. The project was shut down. Rusk resigned. The core prototype was allegedly dismantled, but clearly it wasn't. Holmes gestured to the machine. And now someone is trying to restart it. Why? Mycroft's face darkened. Because if it can work, it changes the battlefield. Imagine a weapon that bends not bodies but time, or at least the mind's experience of it. A man who sees time stutter cannot fight. A leader who loses hours from his memory cannot plan. And if that weapon can reach backward as well as forward, Holmes said, what could it retrieve? Mycroft looked away. You're in dangerous waters, Sherlock. Rusk's death is only the beginning. If you continue this inquiry, you may find your own perception of time unreliable. Holmes pocketed the device without a word. We rose to leave. As we reached the doors of the Diogenes Club, Mycroft's voice stopped us. She was 10 years old, he said. Bright, fond of riddles. Her middle name was Rosalind, Evelyn Rosalind Rusk. If there is a ghost behind this, she is it. Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes paced furiously. He had drawn a timeline across 3 full pages of my medical notes, scrawling events and connections. Someone else was in that workshop after the murder, he muttered. Someone who knew where the core was hidden and took it. What does it do exactly? He turned toward me. According to the journal, it locks a person's attention into a singular temporal pattern. That pattern can be altered, stretched, repeated. In theory, a man could live 1 minute for hours, or lose hours in a minute. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. And if someone were using it now, I asked, then we must find them before they forget how to stop. At that moment the front door burst open below, followed by rapid footsteps up the stairs. Mrs. Hudson's voice called out nervously, "Gentlemen, there's a lad here who says he worked for Mr. Rusk. Says he's in danger." We turned as a thin boy in a rain-slicked cap stumbled into the room. His eyes were wide, terrified, and flicking constantly as if he were seeing things we could not. "My name's Alfie," he gasped. "I was Mr. Rusk's apprentice, but I think I've been forgotten. I can't trust time anymore. You have to help me." Holmes stepped forward carefully. "Tell me, Alfie," he said gently, "what time is it now?" The boy's lip trembled. He looked down at his wrist, where there was no watch. I don't know," he whispered. "I think it's still yesterday." Holmes nodded grimly. "Then we've just met our next clue." Chapter 4. The Silent Apprentice. Alfie Harlow stood trembling at the threshold of our sitting room, soaked through, his rain-spattered cap clutched tightly in both hands. He looked to be no older than 16, with a wiry build and street-worn boots that left muddy ghosts on the rug. His clothes were rough but clean, hand-mended trousers, a patched wool coat, and a scarf so tightly wound about his neck it seemed more armour than warmth. Holmes regarded him with the kind of intense stillness I had learned to recognise as deceptively gentle. He was studying Alfie, not as a boy, but as a phenomenon. The unexpected arrival, the fear in the eyes, the particular angle of mud on the soles of his boots. When Holmes was quiet that long, it meant the game had advanced to a new level. "You were Rusk's apprentice," Holmes said softly. "You were at the workshop before the death." Alfie nodded, jerky, eyes flicking from Holmes to me and back again. "Speak, lad," Holmes said. "Tell us everything you can remember." Alfie opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Not silence, but effort. The shape of speech with no sound. Holmes held up a hand, cutting off my instinctive question. "He's not mute," he said. "He's afraid." Holmes crossed the room, moved a chair by the fire, and gestured for Alfie to sit. The boy did, arms wrapped around himself, jaw clenched as if each word had to be hauled up from somewhere deep and dangerous. "Start small," Holmes said, his voice unusually kind. "The last full day you spent with Mr. Rusk, what did you do?" Alfie shut his eyes, breathing ragged. Then at last, "Cleaned the glass on the phase ring," he rasped. "Took all morning. Then he made me fetch brass from the basement. But I couldn't go in." "Why not?" "Clocks," Alfie whispered, "too loud." Holmes leaned forward. "They were ticking?" "No, ringing, all together, even the broken ones." I felt the hairs rise along my neck. Holmes exchanged a glance with me before turning back. "And Mr. Rusk?" He told me not to go in again. Said it was happening sooner than he thought. Said he might need to leave soon. Then he gave me a bag of coins and told me not to come back for 3 days. "When was this?" Holmes asked. Alfie blinked. "Day before yesterday." I froze. "But he was killed yesterday morning." The boy nodded slowly. I know. That's what I mean. He told me not to come back until Friday. But when I looked at the papers this morning, it said he'd already died, yesterday." He looked up at Holmes, pale as a parchment sheet. "How can that be? He told me—" "Mr. Holmes, he knew he was going to die. He even said he might already be dead." The ticking basement. We returned to the workshop that evening, Alfie in tow. The rain had given way to wind, fierce, dry and bitter, tugging at our coats as we stepped down the narrow path behind the shop. Lestrade had posted a constable by the front, but Holmes had procured access through the back with his usual flair for convenience. Inside, the workshop had not changed, or perhaps it had, in some way not measurable by light or space. The air felt charged. The clocks had grown more still. "Show us the basement," Holmes said gently. Alfie hesitated. "Don't want to go down there." Holmes knelt so they were eye level. "Nor would I, but whatever is happening here, whatever Mr. Rusk was trying to stop, it started in that basement, and we must understand it before it becomes worse." Alfie looked at me, then back to Holmes, and nodded. We descended slowly. The stairwell was narrow and steep, lit only by the flickering of Holmes's lantern. The walls were lined with shelves, some packed with spare gears and glass panes, others draped in cloths that moved slightly in the draught. At the bottom was a metal door with a lever lock, unpainted and cold to the touch. Holmes took a breath and opened it. The air beyond was stale and metallic. with the peculiar sharpness of old oil and scorched iron. The room was large, perhaps once a cellar for coal, but had been converted into a chamber of machines. Shelves of partially assembled timepieces sat beside crates of copper tubing, stacked beside devices whose purpose I could not even guess. The walls were lined with lead sheeting, and in the centre of the floor was a circle, a ring of brass and steel embedded into the stone itself, no wider than a dining table, etched with fine grooves and marks like constellations. At its centre sat a pedestal bearing a mount for the device we had recovered upstairs, the phase engine. But it was missing. Only a circular mark of tarnish remained where it had once rested. Alfie didn't move beyond the doorway. "That's where he used to test it," he whispered. "He said it wasn't safe, said it could fold the wrong things if the power balance wasn't right." "Fold?" I asked. "Time, or memory. He said they were made of the same stuff, and if the coil fired wrong, you could step out of your own moment and not find your way back." Holmes moved around the circle, running his hand lightly over the grooves. "These markings, they're not decorative." "No, sir," Alfie said. "They're patterns." He called them anchors, said the human brain needs anchors to remember the order of time. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "Not merely a device, then, a language of perception, mechanical neurology." He turned to me. "Watson, we're not dealing with hypnosis or drugs. Rusk was building a feedback machine, one that could influence the brain's temporal comprehension. Time wouldn't slow or speed in the world, only in the mind." "But why?" I asked. "What could possibly justify such a thing?" Holmes looked at Alfie. "Evelyn." The boy's face clouded. "Mr. Rusk used to say her name in his sleep," Alfie whispered. "He had a photograph once, but he burned it." "Why?" Said it made her feel too far away. Holmes stood abruptly. "This machine wasn't meant for military use, at least not anymore. He was trying to reach her, to speak to her, or relive something." "Can that even be done?" I asked. "I doubt it, but belief is the deadliest engine of all." He turned to Alfie. "One last question, lad. Did anyone else come here in the last week? Anyone unusual? Well-dressed, official?" Alfie hesitated. "There was a man, tall, grey coat, shiny boots, smelled like matches and leather." Holmes stilled. What did he want? "Said he used to be Rusk's friend. Said he needed the other half of the device." "And did he get it?" Alfie's mouth worked. "I don't know. Mr. Rusk shouted at him, told him to leave. Then he made me go upstairs. I think they fought." Holmes turned, gaze sharp. "Then someone did take the core, and they know how to use it." A warning in brass. We left the workshop just before midnight. Holmes was unusually quiet on the ride home, fingers tapping restlessly on his knee. Alfie had been returned to safety under the watch of one of Lestrade's men, though Holmes had left strict instructions not to let him out of sight. Back at Baker Street, the fire had burned low. Holmes sat at his desk, the strange device, the outer frame of Rusk's invention, laid before him. He rotated one of the silver rings slowly, as if divining some hidden sequence. "There's more to this," he said. "More than just broken time and a grieving mind." He lifted the device and peered at the internal coil again, then stiffened. "Watson," he said, "bring me the lens." I handed it over, and he focused on a series of minute etchings on the internal ring. At first, I saw only lines, then words, letters so small they might have been written by ants. Holmes translated aloud, open quote, "To whoever reads this, I have hidden the core. If it falls into the hands of those who would use it, she will never be free. The anchor is the 10th hour. Look for the name beneath the lion's eye," close quote. He sat back. "The 10th hour," he repeated, "the moment time broke, the moment he tried to preserve." He looked toward the window where the street lamps glowed pale against the fogged glass. "We have our next destination, Watson." Chapter 5. Her Majesty's Secret Time. It was not often that Holmes invoked the full weight of his brother's name to gain entry anywhere, and rarer still that he did so with urgency. But the morning after our encounter with young Alfie and the revelations in the basement of Rusk's workshop, Holmes strode into the Athenaeum Club at 8:30 and requested, with all the gravity of a courtroom judge, immediate access to the vault. Even the senior clerk paled at the request. No one ever asked for the vault. Within the heart of Whitehall, behind closed doors and corridors without signs, the vault was a subterranean archive of unofficial knowledge, not quite legal, not quite classified. Its contents were neither sanctioned nor denied by the Crown. It was said that even the Prime Minister had never seen its full holdings. Yet Mycroft Holmes, by virtue of office and whispered authority, had the key, and Sherlock Holmes intended to use it. The vault, Whitehall, sub-level B. It felt like descending into a mausoleum. The stairs turned tighter the deeper we went, until the light of the upper world had vanished entirely, replaced by humming gas lamps in brass cages. The walls were lined not with concrete or stone, but with burnished steel, insulated, soundproofed, and locked in by design. At last we reached a heavy iron door. A man in a dark green uniform, no rank, no name, stood beside it. He examined Holmes's paper without a word, then turned a crank embedded in the wall. The door opened with a groan of pressurized bolts. Beyond lay the strangest library I had ever seen. It was cold. Too cold for comfort, though not enough to see breath. Shelves rose in stark verticals, no labels, no titles, only brass numbers etched into the ends. Each shelf was packed with manila folders, narrow boxes and books bound in plain cloth. Some bore red wax seals. Others had chains instead of clasps. Holmes walked with uncanny confidence, as if he had been here before. "We are looking," he said, "for references to Project 10, official and otherwise. Look for alternate names as well, Operation Thorn, Mindrail, and anything involving Rusk's early work in Assam." I followed him through the dim maze as he moved along the shelves like a sleepwalker through familiar terrain. At last, he stopped at a shelf marked B128ER. He ran a finger along the spines and paused at a black folio bound in red string. Holmes removed it gently. "Here," he said, "this is the file Mycroft didn't want me to see." We took it to a narrow table under a lamp and spread it open. Inside were brittle pages stamped military, restricted eyes only. The top sheet bore the header, open quote, Operation Thorn, Preliminary Assessment and Field Report, Assam, India, 1882. Lead Engineer, Elijah Rusk, Project Oversight. Major Leonard Hawley, Royal Engineers, close quote. I felt a chill. Hawley, that was a name Mycroft had mentioned only once, and in hushed tones. Holmes scanned the first few pages. Open quote, the experimental device was deployed on site under standard constraints. Subject population, 13 test individuals drawn from local village. Exposure to phase engine lasted 3 minutes, following initial coil resonance. Observed effects, disorientation and spatial confusion in 913 subjects, catatonia in 313 subjects, spontaneous convulsions in 113. Symptoms continued for 36 hours. Note, unauthorized personnel minor entered test perimeter during trial. Subject Evelyn Rusk, aged 10, daughter of lead engineer. Exposure time approximate 40 seconds. Immediate removal ordered. Symptoms unknown. Close quote. Holmes continued turning the pages, his expression grim. Another report followed, a personal letter unsigned. Open quote, Rusk refuses to hand over the device core. He claims it malfunctioned, but I believe he fears its success. The girl is not right. She speaks of seeing time repeat, not memory but repetition. When placed in a darkened room, she insists it is the same night again. She has aged, yes, but not evenly. There are marks on her skin that were not there before. She dreams in clock hands. Close quote. I whispered. Holmes spoke softly. Whatever they exposed her to, it fractured something. Not just memory, not just perception, but some fundamental tether. He turned the page. The final report was blunt. Open quote, Project Thorn discontinued by order of Royal Council. Phase engine to be destroyed, all documentation sealed. Evelyn Rusk to be transferred to Holborn Institute under alternate identity. Engineer Rusk dishonorably discharged. Officer Hawley relocated. Close quote. No mention of what became of Evelyn, I said. Holmes shook his head. But they gave her a new name, buried her, hid the evidence. And yet Rusk rebuilt the machine, I said, years later, in London. To find her again, Holmes murmured, or to undo whatever happened. He looked at me, and now someone else wants that same power. Returned to Baker Street, that afternoon. Holmes spent the next several hours hunched over the journal, a copy of the file from the vault and the phase ring device. He laid them out on the floor, a constellation of knowledge and broken memory. Evelyn's name kept surfacing, in faded equations, as initials hidden in diagrams, and once, most hauntingly, etched into the underside of the glass coil we hadn't seen before. Open quote, ERTR 10, close quote. Evelyn Rosalind Rusk, Holmes said aloud, 10th hour. A knock at the door interrupted us. It was Lestrade. He looked out of sorts. "I've just been pulled from the Rusk case," he said without preamble. "Reassigned by order of the War Office, not even Scotland Yard." "Colonel Aylmer?" Holmes guessed. Lestrade gave a stiff nod. "You've heard of him?" "I've had the displeasure." Holmes turned to me. "Aylmer was once attached to the Royal Engineers in India, assigned to the same unit as Major Hawley. He disappeared from public view after 1884, re-emerged as an intelligence officer at Aldershot. Quiet, efficient, deadly." Lestrade looked between us. "He's not just reassigned the case, he's asked for you to be barred from investigation." Holmes smiled coldly. "Then we're close." Lestrade stepped forward. "Be careful, Holmes. This is no ordinary cover-up. I saw the man myself. His eyes were wrong." "Wrong?" Like he didn't know when he was. "The mark of the lion." Later that evening, Holmes took the engraved warning, "Look for the name beneath the lion's eye," and stared at it for a long time by firelight. "Where does one find a lion's eye in London?" he mused aloud. I thought for a moment. "The statues in Trafalgar Square?" "No," he said. "Too public, too visible. This is a message meant for someone who understands. A riddle." He stood suddenly. "The British Museum. Why there?" "Because its eastern entrance, the lion statues that flank it, are bronze castings from 1871, donated by the Royal Engineers, and one of them has a minor flaw in the casting, a dent beneath the left eye." He turned toward the door. "Come, Watson, the clock is ticking." Chapter 6. The Man in the Uniform. The lion's eye stared blindly toward the fog-laced street as it had for over 50 years, proud, weathered and noble. The statue stood outside the east portico of the British Museum, its great bronze head crowned in shadow beneath the old iron lanterns. London was cloaked in chill mist that evening, the kind that clung to cobblestones and blurred the gas lamps into golden halos. Footsteps rang hollow in that kind of quiet. Holmes and I approached the lion from the south entrance just as the museum was closing. The great oak doors boomed shut behind us with finality, leaving us in a pool of silence broken only by the distant rattle of a hansom cab fading into Bloomsbury. He walked directly to the lion on the left, the older of the pair, cast from battle-worn artillery bronze, and ran his gloved hand just beneath its left eye. "There," he murmured. I leaned in. In the faint lamplight, I could just make out a small depression, not quite a dent, but a worn, shallow curve like the hollow of a tear duct. Holmes pressed his fingertips against it. Nothing happened. He examined it more closely, then withdrew a small knife from his pocket and worked carefully into the groove. A click. Something gave way. A tiny brass panel, no larger than a coin, dropped from the lion's brow and landed in Holmes's hand. He turned it over to reveal a key. Not an ordinary key. Its teeth were irregular, the shaft etched with strange markings. Around the head, a single word had been carved. Evelyn Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he pocketed the key and turned to me. "We are now, without question, beyond the reach of official favour," he said softly. "Whatever door this key opens, it is one that was meant to stay closed." The reading room. We entered the museum again the next morning under more conventional pretences. Holmes had arranged for a private study carol in the central reading room, claiming to be investigating pre-Roman timekeeping for a fictitious monograph. His familiarity with the staff, particularly an elderly catalogue clerk named Miss Kettering, gave us ample latitude. "What are we looking for?" I asked as he laid out the device, Rusk's journal, the military file, and the strange key on a green reading cloth. "A map of rooms long sealed," he said. "There are substructures beneath this place, ancient ones, older than even the museum itself. Tunnels, workshops, even safes carved into the foundation during the 18th century, when the site was first being expanded." He handed me a slim index book. "Start with anything referencing engineering schematics before 1880. We're looking for something built to hide a device, perhaps even test it." I began to search. Hours passed. We found no mention of Evelyn or of Rusk, but then that was to be expected. Instead, Holmes found something better. "Watson," he called quietly. "Look here." It was a hand-drawn map, water-stained, folded 3 times, and tucked behind the pages of an architectural volume. At the bottom, in faded copperplate, a note read, "Open quote, Subchamber Epsilon, Clock Lab Foundation by Royal Commission. Restricted access via South Maintenance Tunnel. Entry requires synchronization key, pattern offset 3, close quote. And beside it, a sketch of a lock. The same odd shape as the key Holmes now carried. The South Tunnel. That evening, with the museum closed to the public and security thinned, we made our way down a narrow servant's stair behind the Egyptian gallery. Holmes had paid one of the janitorial staff handsomely for an unused key, though, as he noted, the odds were high we'd end the night in handcuffs if caught. The tunnel entrance was disguised behind a false crate stamped Musée du Car. Holmes moved it aside, then used the Evelyn key. A low, mechanical click sounded in the quiet. The wall shifted slightly. Holmes pushed it open. The tunnel beyond was narrow, built of old stone and rusting iron braces. Our lanterns threw long shadows against the walls, and the air smelled of lime, oil, and the faint breath of something colder than mere earth. We walked for several minutes, descending slowly. The silence grew oppressive, broken only by the sound of our boots and, once, faintly, the far-off chime of a bell. Then we found the door. It was brass-plated, sealed by a gear lock that clicked with each movement. Holmes inserted the key and turned. The door opened with a sigh. Inside was a chamber like no other. Subchamber Epsilon. The floor was marble, veined with gold, though dulled by dust. The walls were covered in schematic blueprints, pinned and yellowed. In the centre of the room stood a chair, a great brass throne with wires and coils rising behind it like a skeletal wing. Next to it was a machine. The same kind of machine as the one Rusk had hidden, but larger, full-sized, intact. Its rings were polished obsidian, its core thrummed faintly. Holmes approached it cautiously, his breath catching. "This is where it began," he said. I moved slowly through the room. There were notes everywhere, names, diagrams, and pinned to one of the walls a photograph. A girl, dark hair, large eyes, standing beside a clock. On the back, written in the same copper plate as the map, open quote, ERR, age 10. Second test complete. Memory retention confirmed. Close quote. I looked at Holmes. "She's real," I whispered. "She was always real," he said. Then the door behind us clicked shut. We turned. Standing there, framed in the archway, was a man in a dark military coat, gleaming boots and gloves that looked never worn. His face was weathered, yet oddly still, like a sculpture that had forgotten how to age. "Colonel Aylmer," Holmes spoke first. "I presume you've been following us." Aylmer nodded once. "You shouldn't have come here." "And yet here we are," Holmes replied. Aylmer stepped forward slowly. His eyes were off, fixed on nothing, as though trying to focus through a fog only he could see. "You don't understand the machine," he said quietly. "It's not for you." "It wasn't for anyone," Holmes said. "You used it, didn't you?" "I stepped inside to find her," Aylmer said. "I saw her. I remember seeing her, but she's not there anymore. She's not in time." Holmes stepped between me and the machine. "You've been using it again. The effects, the disorientation, the fracture, they've begun. That's why you had Rusk killed." Aylmer didn't respond. Instead, he moved toward the chair. "It can be fixed, if I go back far enough. 10:07. That's where it happened." He sat. "No," Holmes snapped. "You don't understand what it does. You're not going back. You're fracturing yourself forward." But Aylmer pulled the lever beside the chair. The machine shuddered. Lights ignited in the walls, slow pulses of blue and white. The rings began to spin. The core glowed. And then sound. Not noise, sound. Music fractured and rising. Clock chimes, children laughing, rain on glass, screams. Aylmer gasped. "I see her, I see her!" His body jerked once, and then fell limp. The machine hissed and wound down. Silence returned. Holmes stepped forward cautiously, examined the machine, touched the man's throat. "He's alive," he said. "Barely, but his mind is—" He looked at me. Gone, smeared across hours. I stared at the machine. What did he see? Holmes looked back at the photo of Evelyn. His voice was quiet. Whatever he wanted, whatever he remembered, or whatever the machine let him believe. Chapter 7. The Map of Lost Hours. Colonel Aylmer did not speak again. He had to be carried from the subterranean chamber on a stretcher, silent and slack-jawed, eyes wide open yet seeing nothing. The staff who arrived at Holmes's discreet request, 3 discreet orderlies from a private asylum in Hampstead, handled him with the reverence one might afford a fallen bishop. And in a way he was just that, a man broken not by injury but by revelation. a witness who had stared too long into a truth no one was meant to comprehend. The only words he had muttered, during the brief moments his lips moved before catatonia overtook him, were, "She was out of order. The 10th hour's wrong. She turned around and vanished into the same moment twice." It was Watson who noticed the bleeding from his nose, a slow, steady trickle. No trauma, no violence. Simply the cost of something within collapsing under the weight of repetition. Holmes said nothing as they carried Aylmer away. His gaze lingered on the photograph of Evelyn Rusk pinned to the wall and then to the machine itself, now dormant. We remained in the chamber for another 2 hours. Neither of us wished to return to the surface until we had learned something, and what we discovered was not hope, but a map. The second set of plans. It was Holmes who found it, tucked into the lining of the machine's base. A set of folded plans, hidden beneath the leather padding of the control seat. He slid them free carefully, spread them over the cold marble floor, and held his lantern low. The papers were fragile, some nearly disintegrating at the edges and soaked in faded ink and grease marks. Unlike the earlier schematics in Rusk's workshop, these plans were not simple blueprints of the phase engine. They were annotations, notes, paths, corrections to something far older. "Watson," Holmes said in a hushed tone, "this is not just a machine for bending time perception. This is an interface, a console for navigating internal chronology, the way one might leaf through the pages of memory. Like a dream journal? No, like a cartographer's grid, a system of gears and lenses that allow the operator to loop into a specific temporal pattern and repeat it, until their mind imprints upon it." I shivered. Why would anyone want that? He pointed to a line of tiny notations written in Rusk's unmistakable hand. Open quote, "Anchor pattern at 10-7 stabilizes loop at 38 seconds. Longer exposures risk drift. Evelyn's moment was fixed. She remains within it. I must adjust map to bring her forward." Close quote. Holmes whispered it aloud. "She remains within it." He looked at me then, and I understood his expression before he spoke. "You think she's still alive," I said. "I think Rusk believed that if he could replicate the exact emotional and perceptual state Evelyn experienced during her exposure, the room, the light, even the smell of the air, he could bring her forward from wherever her mind had become trapped. Trapped in what? In a moment," Holmes said. "A moment that repeats endlessly for her. A loop in time, not real, but subjective. A prison of perception." I said nothing for a while. The thought chilled me. "Then that's what Aylmer was trying to do," I muttered. "Find her." Holmes nodded. "Or steal the method." But he couldn't stabilize the pattern. His mind slipped sideways. He tried to reach backward. But the map was wrong, and the machine doesn't forgive error. He touched the paper. But Rusk, he had another plan. Rusk's final coordinates. There was more. Pinned inside the fold of the schematic was a small brass disc, no wider than a shilling. A series of numbers were etched into its face. Holmes examined it under his lens. Open quote, 17-2-10-07 AR, basilisk node, close quote. He read the code aloud. The first is a coordinate system, 17-2-10-07, likely a room number, date or encoded location. The next AR, perhaps a person or anchor reference. Then basilisk node, a term he used only once before in the journal. I looked at him. Could it be a failsafe? "I suspect," Holmes said, "this is the location of the core." "The real one?" He nodded. "The central node that powered the original engine, the one stolen from the workshop. And if we are to find Evelyn, or anyone attempting to activate the device again, it must be found first." "But what's the basilisk node?" Holmes was quiet. "In medieval law," he said slowly, "a basilisk's gaze could kill, not because it acted, but because it was seen. Its very observation was fatal." He turned toward me, and his voice lowered. "Watson, I believe Rusk built a room, a chamber that functions as a stabilized loop of time, a place that holds her, or a version of her, locked in endless repetition. Not because she chose to remain, but because the machine looked at her too long." I felt my stomach twist. "Where?" I asked. Holmes turned back to the brass disc. "Camden," he said, and then, "We're going back to the workshop." Return to Rusk's workshop night had fallen by the time we returned to the crooked lane behind the disused churchyard in Camden Town. The workshop was colder than before, dust clinging to the inside of the windows like frost, Most of the clocks had gone silent now, their mainsprings wound down, their ticking stilled. Only one remained in motion. The regulator clock. Its hands read 10:07. Holmes approached it quietly. He adjusted the minute hand backwards, one tick at a time, until it reached 10:06. Then, without warning, he stepped behind the cabinet and pushed. The clock shifted with a groan, and behind it, set into the wall, was a narrow iron door. There was no keyhole, only a slot precisely like the brass disc Holmes now held. He inserted it. The door opened. Inside was a staircase, spiralling downward. The basilisk node. We descended into what could only be described as a preserved moment. It was a room, modest in size, perfectly symmetrical, lit by oil lamps that flickered though no flame burned. The air was still, unnaturally, and in the centre of the room, seated at a small wooden desk, her back to us, was a girl. Motionless, as if time had paused mid-thought, she wore a blue pinafore. Her hair was in plaits. Her hands were poised over a mechanical toy, a tiny wind-up bird, frozen as if waiting for it to sing. Holmes stepped forward. I followed. 10 feet away, then 5. Then the room shimmered. The air shifted, not in heat or wind, but in pressure, like a breath held too long. And then the girl moved. She turned her head only slightly, and in her eyes was a reflection not of us, but of somewhere else. She opened her mouth and spoke one word. Open quote, Papa, close quote. Then the lights blinked, and the moment began again. She turned back to the desk, hands over the toy bird. Holmes grabbed my arm. We're inside the loop, he said. We must not engage, not unless we want to become part of it. I nodded, trying to still my hammering pulse. He stepped around the girl carefully, keeping his distance, examined the walls. The machinery embedded into the corners, small brass dials, hidden vents, and a pendulum embedded in the ceiling that moved. Strangely. It didn't swing, it twitched. Holmes found a control panel in the far wall, tiny levers, a glass dial set to 10:07 exactly. He adjusted it by half a degree. The girl blinked. She hesitated, then turned her head fully toward us, her eyes locked with Holmes's, and she said, open quote, it's the wrong moment. Close quote. The room shook. Lights flared, and then she vanished. No explosion, no fade, just gone. The room went dark. Only the sound of the toy bird remained, ticking, winding, ticking. Chapter 8. The Paradox Child. We emerged from the hidden chamber into cold air and ghostlight. Holmes shut the iron door behind us with mechanical precision, his movements clipped and careful, as though afraid the wrong touch might disturb whatever fragile equilibrium had allowed us to leave. Above, the clocks had resumed their quiet rhythm, but something in the cadence had shifted. I could hear it. A lingering wrongness, not in the ticking itself, but in the silence between ticks. It felt longer, hungrier. Neither of us spoke until we were back on the cobbled street outside the workshop. Holmes lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, a rare sign of agitation, and stared into the smoke like it might realign his thoughts. What did we see? I asked at last, my voice hoarse. Holmes exhaled slowly. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, a residual construct, a repeating echo of Evelyn Rusk, preserved not in memory but in architecture, a closed loop of perception rendered physical by the device's resonance field. I blinked. So she wasn't real? Oh, she was real, Watson, Holmes murmured. But what we saw was not Evelyn as she is now, if she even exists in the present at all, but Evelyn as she was in the moment of her exposure. Trapped in that loop, endlessly repeating the instant before her mind, fragmented. He looked down at the brass disc in his hand, still warm from the door's mechanism. She said it was the wrong moment. She corrected the loop, I whispered. She noticed. Holmes nodded, which means some part of her is aware. Alive, in some sense, responding to changes in the pattern. The idea was terrifying. A child's consciousness, or some fractured imprint of it, caught in endless repetition for decades, enduring the same few seconds over and over, while the world above moved on. Rusk didn't want to free her, Holmes said. He wanted to find the right moment, the moment she could emerge, the moment where everything realigned, and he died before he could. Or, Holmes said darkly, he let himself die. Perhaps he believed death was the final synchronization. I fell silent. There was something sickeningly poetic about it, a man driven to madness by grief, trying to resurrect his daughter not with superstition but with science, Not with seances, but circuitry. Not with memory, but machinery. Holmes ground out his cigarette beneath his heel. "We must find the records from the Holborn Institute," he said. "If Evelyn survived the initial exposure, she would have been taken there under a different name. She would be a woman by now, or something else entirely." The Holborn Institute, Clerkenwell, North London. The Holborn Institute was not a place that courted visitors. Established in 1856 under the auspices of mental rehabilitation, it had since evolved into something less palatable, a halfway house between science and containment, a place for the unclassifiable. Officially it was a hospital, unofficially a vault for lives deemed inconvenient. We arrived just after dawn. The fog still clung to the wrought-iron gates like a shroud. The building was Georgian, squat and grey, its windows too narrow and its corridors too wide. There was no signage beyond a brass plate that simply read, open quote, "Holborn Institute for Neuropsychiatric Exceptionalities," close quote. Holmes showed our credentials, forged but accurate enough, to the sleepy attendant at the front desk. We were soon met by the head physician, Dr. Elspeth Charrow, a severe woman in her 50s with iron-grey hair pulled into a bun so tight it threatened to lift her eyebrows. "We've had no residents by the name of Rusk," she said, once Holmes had outlined his request, "nor any patients admitted from Assam." "Not under that name," Holmes said, "but under one the War Office might have provided. A girl 10 years old, delivered in April of 1882. Possible symptoms: disassociation, temporal confusion, emotional flattening, memory fragmentation." Dr. Charrow frowned. "There was a patient around that time," she said slowly. "Arrived under military escort, no family listed, given the name Clara Holt." Holmes nodded. "May we see her records?" Dr. Charrow hesitated. "They're sealed." Holmes leaned forward, "Then unseal them." She narrowed her eyes. "There's more at stake here than administrative policy," he said. "You have a patient who may have been the subject of an illegal experiment. You owe her that much." A pause. Then Dr. Charrow turned briskly and led us down a hallway lit by flickering gaslight. Clara Holt. Her room was on the second floor. We passed rows of doors, some open, revealing blank rooms with only a bed and a chair, others closed, behind which I could hear murmuring, pacing, weeping. Room 214 was silent. Dr. Charrow opened it. The woman who sat inside was small, pale and still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her gaze did not rise as we entered. She stared instead at the corner of the room as though watching something we could not see. "Clara?" Dr. Charrow said gently. The woman didn't move. "This is Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. They'd like to ask you a few questions." Holmes crouched beside her. "Miss Holt," he said softly, "can you tell me what you see?" Clara blinked, slowly. Then, in a voice like wind through dry grass, "It's always the same morning." Holmes's breath caught. "What morning?" "The bird, the little one. I wound it up, but it wouldn't sing." She turned her head, very slightly, toward him. "Are you the man with the coat?" Holmes didn't flinch. "What coat?" "The long one," she whispered. "The one who came before the window melted." "What happened when the window melted?" "Everything started again." Holmes glanced at me. He reached into his pocket and drew out the photograph, the one from the basilisk node. He placed it gently on her lap. Clara's fingers trembled. She touched it. "My name isn't Clara," she said, and then she began to weep. Evelyn recovered. We remained at Holborn for several hours. Evelyn, not aged properly. Or rather, she had aged unevenly. Her mind remained caught between 10 and something much older. Her memories looped. She spoke in riddles, fragments, sometimes full sentences that came from nowhere, and ended just as abruptly. She could not recall her father's face, but she remembered the sound of his boots on the stairs. She did not know what year it was, but she could describe in perfect detail the buttons on Colonel Aylmer's coat. "She doesn't live in time the way we do," Holmes said as we left her room. "Her perception is fractured, scattered like broken mirror pieces across her own chronology." "Can she be restored?" Holmes didn't answer, but I saw it in his face. He didn't know. A return to Baker Street. That night, Holmes did not play the violin. He sat at the table, staring at the machine's core, the unfinished phase device, and the diagram we'd taken from the basilisk node. "She's not in the loop anymore," he said at last. I looked up. "You mean Evelyn?" He nodded. "She was, but the construct was fading. Her presence, the awareness, had already begun to pull away." The loop was destabilizing, either by the damage of years or by deliberate intent. She was trying to escape, or someone was helping her. I felt a chill. Holmes stood and paced. "I believe," he said slowly, "that someone else has the full blueprint, someone who intends to rebuild the machine in full with Evelyn as the stabilizer, the anchor." I stared. "But why?" Holmes stopped. "To rewrite something," he said, "to reach a point in history they cannot let stand." He picked up the core, and then very quietly, "We are not the only ones who know the 10th hour." Chapter 9. The Clock Strikes Never. There are times, rare and unmistakable, when even London itself seems to conspire with mystery. The morning after our visit to the Holborn Institute dawned still and strange. A dense white fog had descended across the city like a veil. The gas lamps became floating orbs in a pale nowhere. Sound carried poorly, direction became uncertain. It was as though the world had been dipped in chalk water, silent, soft, disoriented. A pause between heartbeats. "It is unnatural," Holmes murmured as he stood at the window of 221B, his tea forgotten. "I do not say that lightly." I glanced up from my chair where Rusk's journal lay open on my lap. "It's only fog, Holmes. London is fond of it." He turned, eyes sharp. "And yet not one bell has rung this morning. Not from St. Pancras, not from the markets, not even the postman's whistle." I hadn't noticed until he said it. The silence was not absence, but removal. The usual chorus of a waking city, footfalls, shouts, iron wheels, dogs, vendors had vanished, not muted, not delayed, simply gone. I stood and moved to the window beside him. Even the crows on the rooftop across Baker Street were motionless. Holmes stepped back from the pane as if it had become a mirror. "The pattern has begun," he said. "A message from the edge." An envelope arrived by special courier not 20 minutes later. The boy who delivered it was pale, shaking, and claimed the man who handed it to him had no shadow in the fog. The envelope was sealed with an old wax insignia, not the royal crest, but an older, more arcane mark, a broken hourglass turned on its side. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a card, the script tight and precise. Open quote, "Mr. Holmes, the final calibration has begun. The loop will resolve at 10:07. You cannot stop it. Only choose your vantage. AR, close quote." Holmes exhaled sharply. "AR, Colonel Aylmer?" I asked. "No." He turned the card over, showed me the faint watermark, a coiled serpent around a stylized crown. "This is from someone within the original project. Not Rusk, not Aylmer, someone else." He looked up at me. "Arthur Rudge," he said. "The assistant listed in Rusk's earliest patents," I recalled. "He vanished in 1883. Exactly, everyone assumed he was dead, but I think he disappeared for another reason, because he wanted the machine to work." Holmes picked up the disk key, the schematic, and the still pulsing fragment of Rusk's device. All laid out on his desk like offerings before a priest. "The reconstruction is underway, somewhere in London. Rudge has the core, the pattern, and a willing host." "A host?" he nodded. "Someone willing to sit in the chair and run the pattern, to stabilize the loop and overwrite a fixed moment in time." "Why 10:07?" I asked. "Why that exact moment?" "Because something happened then," Holmes replied. "Not just to Evelyn, but to them. A mistake, a regret, or perhaps a loss they believe can be reversed." He turned toward the clock above the hearth. It read 9:26, and had done so for over an hour. The vanishing hour. We stepped into the street shortly after 9:30, though time had ceased to feel linear. The fog had thickened, now tinged slightly yellow. Gaslight diffused through it like sunlight underwater. We passed a grocer unpacking crates who looked up at us and said, "Has the bell rung yet?" And when we said it hadn't, he blinked and asked, "Then what day is this?" At the corner of Euston Road, a horse reared against an invisible force, its eyes wild, its breath steaming hard into air that no longer bit back. A newsboy stood on a crate calling out headlines that made no sense. Open quote, "Queen declares war on yesterday." "Clockmaker's curse consumes the West End. All trains to the past delayed by fog." Close quote. Holmes turned to me, breath misting. "The field is expanding. This isn't psychological. The pattern is spatial now." I looked at the buildings across the street. The same man had walked past us 3 times, each time looking slightly more anxious. "Is this what Rusk feared?" I asked. "That time itself could be manipulated?" "No. What he feared," Holmes said grimly, was that perception would override reality, that someone would rewrite the moment so fully it became true, to everyone. He flagged a cab. "To Camden," he said, climbing inside. "Back to the workshop. The source must still be near the original node. He can't have moved the resonance far." The last clue. When we returned to Rusk's workshop, the constable posted outside was gone. The door hung slightly ajar. Inside, the clocks had all stopped, save for one, the same regulator clock from before. Its hands spun backwards. Holmes froze, then darted to the workbench. He tore open a drawer beneath the false floorboard and retrieved a final bundle of papers, ones even he had missed until now. Unfolding them revealed a single phrase, repeated a dozen times, each in different ink. Open quote, "The clock must never strike." Close quote, he flipped the page. Open quote, "If it does, it becomes real. The moment becomes fixed, not only for Evelyn, but for the world." Close quote. "What moment?" I asked. Holmes stared at me, then down at the paper, then toward the ticking regulator, and finally he said, "The moment she died." I felt as though the floor had shifted beneath me. "She didn't survive the experiment," he said. "Not fully. Rusk preserved a fragment, a memory, a pattern, a ghost of her perception, but her body was likely lost in the resonance burst. The child we saw, the one who spoke to us, she exists in memory only, in pattern, not flesh." He looked at the spinning hands. "Rudge intends to lock that moment into history, to resurrect her by fixing her loop as reality. If the clock strikes 10:07, the precise time of her death, and the pattern is stable." He didn't need to finish the thought. "Where?" I asked. "Where is he running the pattern?" Holmes turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "There's only one place with the architecture to support a full citywide loop, a radial building, central, with known subterranean chambers." His voice dropped to a whisper. "The old Parliament clock tower." The tower. We arrived at the base of the disused clock tower, not Big Ben itself, but an older secondary tower once used by the Admiralty, at 6 minutes past 10. The fog had thickened to near blindness. The streets had emptied. Even the gas lamps now flickered erratically, some glowing orange, others blue. Holmes led the way through a back door, unlocked as though waiting for us. Inside, the air was colder than outside. Electric torches had been strung along the stairwell, leading downward into the tower's old basement, long abandoned. At the base, a door of steel stood ajar. Beyond it, the pattern chamber. The chamber of return. The room was octagonal, copper-lined, with rings of machinery rising like organ pipes to the ceiling. At its centre sat the full reconstruction of Rusk's machine, no longer cracked and cobbled together, but complete, symmetrical, alive. And in the chair, the throne, sat a man, Arthur Rudge. He was thinner than the photographs, his face gaunt, pale, and strangely young. His eyes, however, were wrong. They did not blink in time with his thoughts. He looked not at us, but through. "She's ready," he said softly. "The pattern is clear now. You brought me the last coordinates. You led me to her." Holmes took a step forward. "You can't bring her back." "I'm not bringing her," Rudge said. "She never left. I'm just correcting the record. A single moment. A new chronology." "If the clock strikes," Holmes warned, "you won't rewrite history. You'll trap everyone in it." Rudge smiled faintly. "Then we'll be together. Forever." He reached for the final lever. Holmes lunged, but not at Rudge, at the clock. The regulator, restored in full scale, loomed behind the machine. Its hands were now seconds from striking 10:07. Holmes drew a pistol, fired. The bullet struck dead center of the clock face. It shattered. The sound was thunderous, like a bell collapsing inward. Rudge screamed. The machine pulsed once and then failed. All lights dimmed. The air cleared. Time resumed. Chapter 10. The Device That Should Not Exist. For a full 30 seconds after the shot rang out, the world held its breath. The broken clock, the regulator. Shattered and dark against the chamber wall, spilled fragments of brass and crystal across the floor like bones from a desecrated tomb. Its hands, now lying inert and still, would never again point to 10:07. And with their fall, the air in the tower changed. First subtly, a warmth returning, a shift in pressure, and then suddenly, like the uncoiling of a spring held taut for years. The resonance was broken. The pattern had failed. The moment had passed. And Evelyn Rusk, wherever she was or wasn't, would never be returned by force. Arthur Rudge collapsed into the machine's chair, head bowed, his lips moving in silent prayer or madness. Sparks hissed from the base of the phase engine as wires overcharged and blinked out, and a high, insect-like whine from the ceiling gradually faded into silence. Holmes stood amid it all, pistol still raised, the smoke curling from its barrel dissipating like the last wisps of a bad dream. He didn't move, didn't speak, neither did I. Some silences must be honoured. The collapse. It took nearly 20 minutes for the backup generators to fail, for the buzzing lights to die one by one, until only the amber glow of my lantern remained. We worked quickly in the half-dark, Holmes dismantling what he could of the machine, pulling free the resonance coil, fracturing the phase ring with a hammer, prying loose the copper plates that carried the stabilization charge. Rudge did not resist. He sat unmoving, watching the destruction with hollow, ruined eyes. Holmes approached him only once the work was nearly complete. "You remember what she looked like?" Holmes asked him quietly. Rudge blinked. "Only in pieces. You tried to preserve her, but what you preserved was grief, not memory. Grief repeats, memory ends." Rudge said nothing. "She wasn't coming back." "I know," he whispered. "Then why?" Rudge turned his head slowly, like a pendulum winding down. "Because no one else remembered." Holmes stepped back, the wariness now visible in his posture. He gestured to the chair. "Watson." I approached and checked Rudge's pulse. It was strong, his pupils responsive. "He's physically well. Cognitively, I'm uncertain." Holmes nodded. "We'll have him transferred to Holborn, somewhere quiet." "Where they won't ask too many questions," I said. Holmes didn't answer. The final extraction. We left the tower just before dawn. Outside, the fog was lifting. Thin fingers uncurled from the streets, revealing rooftops like the peaks of sunken cities. The sound of London was returning. Hooves, voices, the squeak of wheels. Somewhere far off, a church bell rang. Not 10 or 7. Holmes turned his face toward the sound and closed his eyes. "I feared it might not return," he murmured. I looked back at the tower. "What do we do with the pieces?" I asked. "The parts of the machine?" "Distribute them," he said. "Separate cities, separate nations. Let no man hold all the pieces again." "And Evelyn?" Holmes was quiet for a long time. "She was already gone, Watson, long before we arrived. The construct was a cry in the dark, an echo." He looked down at his gloved hands. "But part of her remained, not just in the loop, in us, in those who remembered, in Rusk, even in Rudge." He exhaled. "We think time is a river, one way, but it's not. It's a room, a corridor, sometimes a prison, and sometimes a song." 1 week later. The Holborn Institute. Evelyn sat by the window now. Not speaking, not blinking, but calm. Dr. Charrow noted that her episodes of confusion had lessened. She no longer mentioned the bird or the moment or the melted window. She had stopped looking for her father's footsteps in the hallway. Holmes and I visited her once. He did not bring the photograph. We stood in silence beside her chair as she stared out into the garden, where nothing grew, but the sunlight still found its way between the iron bars and the bare branches. As we turned to leave, she said only one thing. Open quote. "Thank you for stopping the bells." Close quote. Holmes paused, then nodded, and we walked away. Baker Street, 1 month later. Spring came early that year. The clocks in London ticked as they always had, imperfect, occasionally misaligned, but moving, unstuck, present, human. Holmes had placed the remaining fragment of the phase engine, a small gear no larger than a coin, in a velvet-lined drawer beside his violin. It would never be used again. I hoped no one would ever find the rest. He no longer spoke of Evelyn Rusk, but I saw her in his silences, in the way he stared at the hearth late at night, in the moments his fingers hovered over the strings of his violin before choosing not to play. In the crease of the old schematics still folded into the pages of his books, he had solved the case, but not the grief. Epilogue, a letter in the wall. Some weeks later, while replacing a loose board beneath the hearth, Mrs. Hudson found a sealed envelope. It bore no stamp, no mark. Only the name, open quote, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, close quote. Inside was a single page, open quote, "If you are reading this, it means the 10th hour never came. Thank you for that. I was never meant to be more than memory, but I was remembered, and that was enough. ERR, close quote." Holmes read it once, and then, very gently, placed it in the fire. The flames curled the paper like a sleeping hand, and the clock above the mantel ticked on, never striking, never stopping. Simply, now. The end.
This was Sherlock Holmes and the Clockmaker's Paradox, written by Barrel Coops.
I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I have written over 500 short stories over the years under many pen names. I will be updating these and recording them under the Barrel Coops name. I will be listing them on YouTube as fast as we can get them recorded. They will include historical drama, humor, adventure, romance, period drama, mystery, thriller, war stories, spy stories, revenge, horror, psychological horror, dystopian, disaster, children's stories, love stories, and more. Too many to name. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel. Until next time, thank you for listening to the end.